I'm Karen Tracy, and I'm chairing and delighted to be chairing this panel. As you know, we're coming up at NCA on our 100th anniversary, so we have this series of 5-year out panels. And so today, this session is bringing you the group communications vision of that, and I bring to you 3 of our initial leaders. This division, although group communication has always been an important part of our association, it was associated or sort of part of interpersonal or organizational or other areas. And so it really has been a division only for about 10 years. So it's 3 of the initial leaders and Dennis Gowron, who won the Distinguished Career Award. The 2 leaders, and we're missing one who should be along soon, Larry Fry should be here soon, Joanne Keaton and Lisa Milhouse, who were the original leaders in the division. So let me just tell you, for these panels, and there's a lot of them going on at NCA this year, divisions were asked to reflect on a set of questions. So I'm going to read the 5, and our panelists were given kind of speak to these issues. And so we'll hear from each of them speaking to one or another of these 5 issues, and then we'll have a chance for discussion. And so the questions posed in this panel were, what is the historical development of your division in the discipline and in NCA? Second, what are the major themes and contributions of your area over its history? What is the state of the art? Third, where is your area headed? What do you want to accomplish at NCA Centennial? Fourth, what are the greatest resources you bring to the discipline, and what are the challenges in meeting your goals? And finally, what are your greatest contributions to communities inside and outside of the academy? Where does and where can your area make a difference? So without saying anything more, we'll start with Joanne Keaton at North Carolina State University. Yeah, I think so, because they're taping. And I'll give people a 3-minute warning.
Okay. Good afternoon. I have laryngitis. I'm not contagious. It's my warning. I'm really delighted to do this panel, and I hope to answer some of the questions, but I hope to also goad some of you into further action. Not me, right? I'm going to leave the historical development of the division. It's a very, the division itself is very young, less than 10 years, and but there has been a long history of the study of group communication in the field. Even some of the first articles in QJS were about group communication. And given that we have Dennis on the panel, are you going to cover history stuff, Dennis?
I had planned to say a few words.
Good. I was hoping that he might. My remarks, also being one of the initial founders of the group division, my remarks are also influenced by 2 other things. And the first of those is I'm the editor of Small Group Research, an interdisciplinary journal, primarily communication, management, and psychology scholars, but we take manuscripts from about 30 different disciplines. So that colors my remarks. The second thing that colors my remarks is I'm also the founder of the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research, which grew out of really the birth of this division. We realized that group scholars were scattered across many disciplines, and we each had a pocket where we went to our own national meetings, but those group scholars never had a place to come together. And so in group-like fashion, other members of this division, including Gwen Wittenbaum, we sat in a bread and breakfast up in Michigan one summer and created the Interdisciplinary Network of Group Research, or what we call InGroup. And I've been central in that association since its founding. And so we're coming up on our 5th year, and so at 95 and 5, I've got 100. So my remarks are colored by not just my experience here at NCA studying group communication, but also that. And then finally, my remarks are colored by the fact that I came to graduate school to study groups. I was working for the Federal Reserve Bank. I was responsible for 200 task groups, and the groups weren't doing what I wanted them to do. And the Federal Reserve sent me to finish my education and to figure out how to make groups work better. So I come to this from a very practical point of view. It's not something I stumbled into, but it's something that I pursued then, and I'm still pursuing today. So the questions I'm going to, I want to look at are where are we headed? Being the editor of small group and being involved in interdisciplinary network for group research in this division, I think where we're really headed is really an open-ended question. Where I would like to see us headed is in terms of methodology and becoming far more sophisticated in our use of technology to assist in data collection and data analysis, particularly in data coding. And here's the reason I say this. I've had the opportunity to work with human factors scholars, and they are going to do this if we don't. And they are going to do it in such a way that you will not be able to identify communication out of it. For them, information sent is communication. It's not the message, it's not the meaning, it's not the interpretation, it's not the action after the communication. So literally, they have a very mechanistic view of communication or information exchange, and there are hundreds of these scholars working frantically with the assistance of grants from the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, NSF, and we have to be part of that conversation. We have tried really hard to introduce them to interaction process analysis because it's an inclusive coding scheme that can go across all kinds of contexts. And they really have a problem because we can't code it automatically. So what they tend to do in human factors is tie coding to the content, not to the process or the function. And we're arguing with them that it takes both. And so I want to really push us not just to continue to study more groups, but to study groups in a way that we're involved in a better interdisciplinary conversation with folks who have the means and the skills and the resources we don't have. So that's a huge challenge, and I recognize that. But we have to get ourselves playing in that interdisciplinary part of the world. I used to think that our competition in studying groups was psychology. Well, that's pretty much dropped out. Now it's pretty much OB, organizational behavior management. And the focus there is, of course, always on a task. The groups have to be doing something hard, and we all know that groups do things other than hard tasks. So I think for where we headed, it's where I would like to see us be headed, and that's to be more sophisticated users of technology. And that's going to require retraining and retooling and really thinking outside of the box. So my encouragement to you is if you have human factors folks on your campus is to start to talk with them about what they're doing in their labs, because we may be able to find a way to integrate our opportunities with their opportunities and really move ourselves forward. I would certainly hate for human factors to take the lead in analyzing group interaction. That's what they call it. That's not what they're studying. But they're co-opting our language, and we need to be careful of that. So that's one place I really would like to see us head. Some of the greatest resources, I want to talk to the resource and the challenges question, and one of the greatest resources I have is that we do understand communication, and few other disciplines do. That's very obvious to us when we go to the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research Conference, is that they'll all day talk about how the team members communicate, but there's never analysis of the message, there's never analysis of the meaning, and forbid say the word symbol. That's completely out of their mindset. But everyone is studying what we believe we have as central. And again, it's a resource we have, and we're not making the best use of that resource. And I'll talk in a minute about ways I think we can do better. We are really challenged that our work, particularly as published in the NCA and ICA journals, is sequestered on a database called Communication and Mass Media Complete. And what I mean by sequestered is if you publish in an NCA or ICA journal, that's where your research gets hid in most university libraries. And OB and psychologists don't use that database as a resource. Where we wouldn't think of doing a research project and not checking Business Source Premier and not checking the psych abstracts, we are not on their radar. And so we have to figure out a way to make what we know about communication and group communication more specific and particular to them. So we're very good at pulling in from other disciplines. We're not very good in terms of reaching out. And again, these are conversations that are more likely to happen more effectively locally with your own colleagues at your own universities to demonstrate the importance of understanding messages and meanings. So that's a real challenge for us. The other challenge is fewer and fewer of our doctoral programs are offering tracks or sessions in group communication. And for me, and I don't think it's because I started out studying groups, I really have tried to look at this fairly objectively. To me, the group level of analysis is the most meaningful level of analysis. It's from what you can extract interpersonal and can move up to a more abstract level of organizational or any kind of a unit of analysis, societal unit. You can't do that in interpersonal. So the group level has far more consequences for our daily lives. We live in groups, we play in groups, we work in groups, we help our community in groups. We are essentially a group-centric society. And I know people will say, well, we're individualized. It's an individual organization. We're individuals. I don't really think that. I dare you to go through a day and not rely on anyone but yourself. That we are constantly put in this mode of looking at group communication and its consequences on our lives and others' lives as well. So few group doctoral programs is a big problem because they're not producing a lot of young group scholars. We particularly see this at Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research, where about 70% of the doctoral students that attend are from OB and management programs. So that's, again, something that we need to be thinking about. And, of course, I think another big challenge, and you all know this, is time to research completion, is that if you really study a group, and you've studied it longitudinally or you've studied its messages and meanings in depth, that it's far more time-consuming than doing survey data. However, I can't emphasize enough the importance of studying communication. Joe has a great story, and I hope we'll have time for him to share it, but we have people all the time telling us that communication isn't important. That we could just, Joe's story is, we'll just rank order the things and send it in. But no, why do we have to come together as a group? Because the task hinges on the relational. The trust, my relationship with you, how cohesive I am to you, how satisfied I am with our relationship. You cannot take the person out of the group. We can figure out all kinds of nifty technological ways to meet online, but still, why do we all come to NCA? There's something about that person connection, and it's those person connections and groups where we create our identity. And so the time it takes to really study those kinds of groups is far longer than it would take to do a quick survey. That's a real challenge for us. And finally, I want to address what's our greatest contribution to the communities inside and outside of academia. And I'm going to speak to outside. And I would say that we haven't made a great contribution. It was made early on in the 50s and 60s, and we have backed away from it. We now know that group communication classes are more frequently taught by people who have no training in group communication and by TAs. So where our contribution is, I think, is really left up to us. I don't mean to paint a picture of doom, but given these other experiences that I've had in conjunction with my experience as a group communication scholar at NCA, I think we're at the point of a wake-up call. That we're going to have to think about doing work differently, inviting different people potentially to our conversations here, which generally are very robust. And so for me, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. That we want to preserve what we know best, which is about communicating in groups and those messages and those meanings, and that we want to demonstrate that it does make a difference what message you send and what meaning is extracted. Thanks.
And our next speaker is Dennis Gowron. And Dennis, I think you should come up here because we're videotaping.
I agree with a great deal, if not everything, that Joanne just told you, so I feel a bit of a challenge in coming up with something that she didn't cover that may be of interest. When I agreed to serve on this panel, I hadn't reflected on the fact that we are 5 years as an association from being 100 years old, and that I have been a part of this for 41 of those 95 years. As a younger person, I used to sit back and wonder why people talked about how it used to be in the discipline, and now I'm in the position of sharing with you how it used to be in the discipline. So I will probably spend a little more time on the first question than some of the others. I also had a little difficulty discriminating on whether or not I was speaking on behalf of people in the area or speaking on behalf of myself. So I will sometimes be confusing, I'm sure, what I think I may have offered as an insight of some sort or a contribution with what lots of other people who are interested in the study of communication processes in groups were attempting to do. But insofar as the historical development of the division in the discipline is concerned, I entered as a PhD in 1968. This was a time at which we were still the Speech Association of America. There had been the famous Wingspread Conference, and more germane to the interests of this group, the New Orleans Conference, or so it is named. People assembled at those conferences, and one of the consensus points was that for a discipline that calls itself the Speech Association of America, that wanted to call itself the Speech Communication Association, there was precious little in the way of an accent on actual communicative behavior. And there were not a lot of people in the 1950s doing work in the area of group studies in our discipline in general, but such work as was going on was not characterized by an accent on communicative behavior. If you look back at the 1950s, there were Laura Kroll and Tom Scheidel, Ernest Borman, who wasn't doing a whole lot of original research in group studies, but was fascinated by the potential of group discussion for larger forms of social organization, and we all know the history that subsequently grew out of that interest. And Vic Harnack, who didn't spend a whole lot of time focusing on what people said, but was more concerned with personal qualities and characteristics that might influence the ways in which they paid allegiance to what was then a dominant focus in pedagogy, and that's applications of the Dewey method of reflective thinking. So about the same time, I don't know, fortuitously or by divine intervention, Aubrey Fisher, Dale Leathers, and I all came out at the same time and took these people seriously who were saying we ought to focus on communication, but didn't seem to have the time to get around to doing that. That, I think, set in motion a number of critiques of the study of communication in groups, or more appropriately, the absence of the study of communication in groups under the aegis of group communication. And we attempted to make the utterance as the focus of attention, and how the utterance and the various properties that were exhibited by it in group settings could ultimately help us account for a number of different kinds of outcomes, most of which at the time had to do with the quality of choice that people in decision-making and problem-solving groups were exhibiting. And we felt that indeed it would be quite revealing if we could identify those characteristics and tie them in systematic ways to variations in the kinds of outcomes that these sorts of groups achieved. Now, the part of the discipline that is associated with this division underwent further refinement. We were initially, when the name change was from Speech Association of America to the Speech Communication Association, put into a constitutional structure that, I know you're going to find this hard to believe, allowed for only 5 divisions in the association. It seems these days, if you have 3 people, you have a division and 15 or 20 programs to fill. That a gratuitous comment, but there has been a proliferation. At the time, however, there were these 5 divisions that were acknowledged, which sort of went out of existence as people's interests refined. Well, we were part of the division of interpersonal and small group interaction, as it was called. And it quickly became dominated by people who were in the area of interpersonal communication, most of whom didn't study communication. They studied reports of communication. They studied visions of what people saw themselves doing if they found themselves in particular kinds of situations and how they would manage these, all to the advantage of the reporter. A lot of self-serving testimony, I think, came out of that focus. And I think also there were feelings among people like those sitting in this panel and elsewhere in the room that those who were studying communication were kind of getting shortchanged when it came to the allocation of programs. It was against that backdrop that I think as we underwent further reorganization that Joanne and Scott Poole and Larry Fry and others I am sure I'm leaving out, Lisa, began to say enough is enough and we want our own division. So that's been the evolution of the division of group communication as I have experienced it between 1968 and the present. What have been the major themes and contributions in this area of study over its history, or the 41 years that I think I'm capable of accounting for? I think there have been 3 in particular. There's been a focus on interaction. There has been development of theory, and there's been an increased receptivity to qualitative work in the study of communication processes in groups. The focus on interaction, I think I've already commented on, and how that came to be. It was through the inspiration of critics who were concerned that as a discipline we were not doing much to study communication, and nonetheless not at all ashamed by the fact that we wanted to utilize that label. Insofar as theory is concerned, there were a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, critiques of the status of small group research and inquiry, and one of the repeated themes was that there was a lack of theory. We were just asking questions and trying to arrive at answers that weren't suggested by any set of assumptions, precepts, propositions, and derivatives of those propositions. The people working in this area, I think, received some undue criticism. It was almost fashionable for a while to say that this is a group of people who never does anything except talk about what they ought to be doing. And to some extent, that's fair critique. On the other hand, I think those discussions were important because what has emerged in the time that I've been around, even though it is in every case somewhat derivative, has been the emergence of the functional perspective on communication in decision-making, problem-solving groups, which has been subsequently an area that has enjoyed a lot of research inquiry. We had the application of Giddens' work to relational development in groups and the role that communication plays, and the contribution of Scott Poole and his associates to showing how communication is both a determinant of relationship development and a consequence of relationship development. And there's no question that that has been an extraordinarily productive area of scholarship. Ernest Borman's grappling with the question of how cultures in groups develop through an accent on fantasy themes, the sharing of those themes, the evolution of fantasy types, and their ultimate utilization in the interpretation and exchanges of messages, I think was another contribution. And while the research output has not been as substantial with the theory of symbolic convergence, it of the four perspectives would probably be one of the two that is most original in nature, but he too is indebted to prior work by Robert F. Bales. And then finally, we have had significant emergence in the area that goes under the heading the bona fide group perspective, a legitimate critique on the part of Linda Putnam and Cynthia Stoll, who sort of spearheaded that perspective on communication in groups, has been to acknowledge that communication doesn't occur in vacuums, and that what we may have been studying in laboratory settings could bear little resemblance to what goes on in, quote, real-world groups, if you like that particular characterization. And I think their contribution has been to call attention to the fact that a good deal of what goes on within groups, communicatively speaking, is in significant part determined by what goes on outside those groups. And I think we have a richer understanding of group process by looking at the infusion of influence from external sets of circumstances. So I think those have all been four very healthy developments in the advancement of this part of the discipline. And finally, I think there has been, in this particular category about major themes, an increased receptivity to qualitative work in the discipline. When I entered the field, if you said you were identified with this area, that by implication meant that you did quantitative research, or you taught. That was sort of the bifurcation that we had. You either taught people how to talk good in groups, or you did research of a quantitative nature and tried to utilize the most sophisticated methods of inquiry then available for the analysis of information. With the emergence of these theoretical perspectives, I think there has been also a tolerance that I didn't see existent back in the early 1970s for qualitative forms of inquiry and a greater appreciation for case studies. The increased reliance on looking at aspects of group process from a more phenomenological kind of perspective, and narrative analysis has been a development of which we have a good exemplar seated on this platform. The third question, what are the greatest resources that you bring? The way that's phrased, that's why I get a little confused about whether I'm talking about myself or other people. So, but what are the greatest resources you bring to the discipline, and what are the challenges to meeting your goals? I think as a division that is developed along the lines that we're talking about, it seems to me more so than some areas elsewhere in the discipline, this particular division has brought a sense of historical perspective to the study of group processes that I don't see existent in some other areas. I think it's brought a sense of vision, and that's partly a result of the kind of critique that, as I said earlier, was subject to criticism, if not in some instances ridicule. And I think people in this discipline have, or this part of the discipline, have demonstrated a set of critical skills sufficient to help separate genuinely good work from that in need of greater refinement. And I've just been told to stop, which I will do.
So it'll stop. I think I did do that. No, so funny. And so this brings us to our third panelist, Lisa Milhouse. Lisa.
I'm honored to be here this morning. This afternoon I'm losing my voice a little bit. I wanted to bring a different perspective to this. I feel very honored to be on a panel with these folks. I was a graduate student with Dr. Borman at the University of Minnesota, and I was there at a time when Scott Poole was there and Dean Hughes was there, and there was a lot of excitement about small groups at that point. And it was right then that we were trying to collect signatures, and the group division wasn't the only division at that point. The GLBTQ division was beginning to start, and the Asian Pacific division, and a number of others. So there was all of this excitement because the grad students were needed, because our signatures mattered and our membership mattered. And so that was sort of my introduction, although, I'd been studying for, a number of years the history and all of these important articles that I had read and done some research on it. What I'm really interested in is how academics handle themselves in groups. And that was my master's thesis, was looking at how intercultural academics developed as a group. And so for me, it was just fascinating to look at this area that I was interested in and see how it was developing. So I signed up. I was one of those signatures that got us a division, and I went to the first business meeting, and I volunteered to be the secretary of the division. I was a new graduate, and I was an assistant professor, and so I volunteered to be the secretary. And so that was sort of my beginning with this. And so I'm so glad that we had Dennis here to give what led up to that point. And I really appreciate your vision, Joanne, because a lot of what you do, and I really respect all of the in-group work and other work that you're doing to get us to move forward. And I want to characterize a little bit your idea that this is a wake-up call, because I sort of feel like the emergence of the division has been a process where we've been waking up. It's been a process of waking up. And one of the things that I did as the secretary, whereas I developed the website, which I maintained well for about 6 years and maintained poorly for about 4 years, and finally have tried to pass along to someone else to find someone else to do. But early on, it was so important that we talk to each other, that we figure out a way to announce, because we didn't have all academic at that point, so there was no easy way to see, well, what is the group division doing? Who is part of the group division? Who are the people who are submitting the papers and things like that? And to try and develop the website, I sort of saw at that point we had kind of 3 different groups. We had folks who were grad students or who were active researchers training grad students. Who were involved in small group. We also had folks who were more consultant. They were working, maybe they were doing engagement in the business world, helping them with groups. And we had those folks. And then there was, of course, this army of teachers who had no background in groups and as you know, group communication is the hardest course to teach because they gang up on you. And if you don't know anything about how to handle groups and conflict, you're dead in the water. And we have an army of adjuncts who are trying desperately to try and do that. And so to try and help people pick textbooks and help people see what textbooks were out there, and that was part of that early work to try and communicate with each other about what we had. I remember in the early period and even in the middle period of the last 10 years, a lot of worry about there's not enough scholarship. Are we getting enough submissions? Are people really doing research in this area? And I remember one year going to a top 4 panel, which were really good studies, but they were all very traditional, quantitative, small task groups who had done a task and then got measured. And I thought, the person who introduced it was saying this is the cutting edge of group communication. And I thought, oh dear, and they were the best. I'm sure they were the best that were submitted, and they were wonderful Studies. But I thought, where are we going if we're still doing that, you know? And so I think there is one of the ways that we've really grown and contributed to our discipline is by becoming interdisciplinary and to look beyond communication, look to see what is going on in group communication beyond communication. And I see that as some of the important work that we've done. One of the things that I did about 5-6 years ago was I did a panel where I asked a group of senior scholars, you know, what do we mean by a group? You know, can we even agree on that basic definition? And the reason I put this panel together was I was a reviewer for a journal, and I submitted my review of this group's article, and I got to see the reviews of the other folks. I didn't know who had written them or anything, but I got to see their reviews. And we spent all of our time arguing about whether or not this was a group's article rather than critiquing the substance of the article. I thought, well, if we can't agree on whether this is a group article or not, you know, that's a problem. And in that panel, we discovered, in fact, that we didn't always agree on what constituted group communication and what constituted a group. And I think that's part of our development, part of our growth in doing that. The last thing I wanted to comment on was I noticed, because I was, you know, an excited new assistant professor when we started this journey, I've noticed over time the character of the division has changed a little bit. At the beginning, the people who were running for the chair of the division were all of the big names, the people who deserved to be chair because there had never been a division for them to be chair of, and they certainly would have never been chair of the interpersonal and small group division. And so, you know, Dennis was a chair, and Scott Poole, and Larry Fry, and Hirakawa. And once we'd sort of exhausted our more senior faculty, then it became an important role for the associate professors, the folks who were looking for promotion, looking for a way to contribute. And there was you could see clearly how that changed, where we were, first it was so important to honor the folks who had been with us, who had been really slugging along. And then I remember distinctly, we always would have readers for the convention, and we would always approve them by acclamation. And there'd be 20, 25 folks who would be on the list. And I remember one year somebody challenged the list. And someone said, who are these people who are going to read these papers? What are their credentials? And how, well, you know, why? And that was the point where it changed, where the folks who were the more senior researchers and scholars were no longer the leaders of the division, but were the gatekeepers in the as reviewers. And so there was, I don't think it was intentional, but there was this moment where graduate students became there were less opportunities to be a graduate student in the division, I think. And we were more interested in looking at rigor and less interested in looking at mentoring. And so I would say if there's anything I would challenge people to do as we move forward is to think about how do we mentor people to get through this. I know in my university, which is a master's terminal institution, we've desperately hired somebody finally who is a small groups person, and then there's myself who's there. But we largely have adjuncts who were teaching our small groups. And the faculty sort of said, well, do we really need this as a required course? You know, it's a lower level required course. Maybe this is one, if we have to get rid of one, we could get rid of this one. And I'm sure that's elsewhere where it's harder to staff than it is, and maybe it's not worth it. And I think that the more we can mentor students, graduate students and future faculty, to carry on. Sorry. I guess my voice is telling me we're done. But I thought that that's my thought as a junior scholar who really has appreciated belonging to this group division. Thank you.
So we have plenty of opportunity for questions, comments, discussion. So let me turn it over to the audience and see if you can get us started. Issues you want to raise? Yeah.
This is really encouraging because I'm just starting. This is my first to hear about the directions that you for fourth division. My question is for Dr. Keaton. You mentioned the need for scholars to seek out interdisciplinary work and to stay ahead of game, so to speak. And you mentioned in particular human factors research, which I'm not very familiar with. So if there's a few things that you can say about that,
Sure.
whether there is possibility to intersect with that in a qualitative sort of way or not.
Sure. Human factors research is the area of research which kind of takes the information science aspect of technology and then weds it with human need and motivation. So these are the folks that when you go to your ATM, they've designed the screen, they've designed the programs. When you go check in for your flight at the airport, they've designed those kiosks. And so in other words, it's the interface between the technology and the human. Right? So they're heavily involved in grant research that looks at how soldiers communicate as a unit in the field, with what kind of technology devices they might use, how emergency medical technician teams communicate in a crisis, and their solution always is more technology. And the great thing about trying to integrate with them is that they've captured all the data, all the communication. And so they literally now have gear where they talk into their sleeve like the FBI guy. And so they're all on separate channels. So you have the whole unit communicating the verbals, you have their verbal comments, but you also have everything that they've done in technology, either in writing or drawing maps or all that as well. So in one way, they have in very sophisticated ways captured the data that you and I would capture by the standard audio and videotaping, but in a much more sophisticated way. What they don't consider is what the influence of that verbal communication is, or even the written messages. It literally is a transmission device, and because their research is so heavily invested in what I call a hierarchical command and control, that there are certain roles and patterns that communicate. But we know what happens in a crisis. We've all watched the evening news. We've all heard those 911 calls. When a crisis happens, the hierarchical command and control routine falls away. And so that relationship, the relationship that the unit members create and how they communicate with one another in those crisis situations becomes so very important. So what I would hope that we would be able to do is interface with them in a way that we can take advantage of their technology, but help them see what they're missing by relying completely on the technological transmission and not thinking about the human part of it.
So, taking off on that same question, I was intrigued by that because I've worked at NOAA, a federal agency, and NCAR, and they are attracted by the human factor because it's very quantitative.
Right.
So how do you see qualitative methods?
Well, human factors are doing quite a bit of qualitative work. It is not the same type of qualitative work that you and I perhaps might do. I just got back from an NSF site visit where they're also doing this with virtual organizations online. And they're trying to figure out how to do the qualitative aspect of it. Because it's like any network analysis. They can track who talks to who. They haven't got a clue what they're talking about. Which, I keep telling them probably does make a difference. So the qualitative work comes from being in the field, and they allow researchers to be in the field. It also comes from a close textual analysis, a type of interaction analysis that you would do offline. The complaint, however, is that when the kind of textual analysis that Karen does or interaction analysis that I do is that it's not quick enough. The feedback can't be generated quickly enough to help the team in the field at that point. Right? So it takes how long to do? Yeah. We know every nuance of the spoken word in 4 months. They want it much more rapid, and we're going to have to figure out how to bring that rapidity to our research to make it fundable and to be integratable with these other disciplines. So that's the trick, is what can we use of what they're generating, and how can we then use that perhaps as to create a first pass at the data?
Because
because I do think all these federal agencies are very interested in communication and are open to discourse analysis and other things, but there's this lag.
That's the lag, and they hate it, and they don't want it. And because we can't do the feedback quick enough, they're going to default to someone who's going to give it to them.
Joe?
Let me offer this observation so you think about it. Our two most cognitive divisions in NCA are interpersonal and research on what is LSI. Do you still have your membership in LSI, Karen?
Oh.
I do too, and I don't go to as many panels as I like because they wouldn't be having this conversation at all. They would get communication. Interpersonal does not the way Dennis described it or Joanne described it. The nice thing about us having this conversation is we're somewhat between those two camps, where we want to say we look at discourse in a way that matters like LSI does, but we also want to talk about it in a functional role that the interpersonal folks say they do, they don't. So one of the things that I think is healthy, some of my best friends are
Yeah, he's just going to say that, friend.
and you know,
That's relational.
I'm also the institution review board person for our department, so I get to sign off everything that comes through on my call. I love my colleagues. No one looks at communication, not the way Dennis described it. So the nice thing about having this conversation is that we have some issues to talk about and work through that make us, I think, more relevant. The contributions we kind of make in a discourse space where related to functional aspects on one side, language on the other side. Does that make sense? Is what we, to me, what we have is the most exciting combination of what those two divisions have.
Right, and I would guess I'd also challenge us is that group communication scholars should be saying more about communication. I believe that the group is the test bed. And so we should be saying more about communication in general, not just group or team communication in the specific. That it really is the place to test out some of those ideas.
Let me ask a related question of monopolized floor time. When and Dick Moreland published a review of the social psychology journals, it was a book chapter, and I think some small number, and I recorded this in CR, less than 10% actually has something to do with intra-group processes.
Right.
If you had to hypothesize what the percentage would be for communication journals, what percentage across all divisions, what percentage would be looking at actual communication?
Well, I can answer that because
Gwen and I are going to do this, but
yeah, I would. I'm also the editor of Communication Currents, so I'm probably the only person on the face of the earth that reads every article published by NCA. And I have to read them because I have to invite them people to write a translation. And the first decision factor is it about communication? And I would say unequivocally, issue after issue after issue, I publish 6 times a year, 50% of the publications fall away because they're not communicative. And sometimes I see the communication and I invite the author to write a translation, and they'll tell me they're not interested in the communication. So hypothetically, 30% is about 30% of what we publish is really about communication, and too much of that is still perceptual, self-report. That has been the really tough thing about Communication Currents for me. And then what is it with group communication? I don't know. Luckily, the things that get submitted to small group research from communication scholars are generally highly communicative. And I'm so pleased to see those, and of course also pleased to publish them.
I don't have a specific estimate on that, but I would concur in the judgment that it's of a relatively low order of frequency, that a focus would be on communicative acts and relationships among acts in different areas of the discipline where people are claiming that they're making inroads into our understanding of communication processes, and you can't find an utterance that's reported. It's almost as if, communication is vehicle, and as long as it gets you there, then it's the destination that's important, not the conveyance. And So I think there's, throughout the discipline, a lot of claims about how communication functions for which there's no empirical evidence.
Dean's not here.
No.
Well, I think I would have heard him if,
You would have heard him by now.
if he had been.
Yeah.
For Dr. Goward, you mentioned greater receptivity in division to qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what might have spurred that? Is it are you just taking a different direction, or is there a genuine recognition that it has something to add to the quantitative work that has been done?
Well, I don't have a specific sociological explanation for that phenomenon as it may have found its way into inquiry. But there has been in my career a receptivity to a concept of data that I never heard when I was in graduate school or early in my career, and that's richness. And it sort of comes out of the linguistic tradition in terms of description, thick description and thin description, if that's the appropriate label. And this all centers on this concept of richness. So you can get at deeper levels of understanding through more intensive examination of the characteristics of utterances and the ways in which they pattern themselves within specific acts. But if you're going to do that, there's trade-off. And the trade-off is that you can't study 150 groups that way and draw conclusions. So I think there's something in an appreciation that numbers were not giving us the depth of understanding that more careful critical analysis of characteristics of acts do, and that has fostered an appreciation of this kind of inquiry. So.
I'll add to that. It was in the early 90s, and we were really having a lot of hard time getting qualitative studies published because communication monographs wouldn't look at it. The division and all group scholars owe a real debt to Larry Fry. I mean, it was kind of born out of frustration, and he put together a series of edited books that were really the first explorations and they were case studies or case analyses of groups in context first. That was the first unusual thing. And then they were all some kind of qualitative, textual, or interaction analysis. And that then gave us something to cite. And there was a real strategy to it. That gave us something to cite. And then by the third book, it was not contestable anymore. At about the same time, the field in general became more accepting of qualitative research in general. And those two things, but specifically, I mean, the group scholars really do owe debt to Larry for seeing that as a need. He didn't have problem filling the books. I mean, there were enough of us doing that kind of work, but being frustrated about finding a home for it because it tended to be longer in length, etc. And so I think he's on his fourth volume of those kinds of things. But that they happened in pretty rapid succession right there at the beginning. They gave us something to cite. The field was coming around to qualitatively in general, more positively, and that was right at the time of the birth of the group division. And so we could, once we got separated from interpersonal, then that gave us more license also to do more qualitative presentations of qualitative work, because that hadn't happened in the interpersonal and small group division, trust me. I mean, it wasn't at all uncommon to be giving a presentation in that old division and do a group analysis and then someone pin you to the floor why you hadn't studied their perceptions. So we were trying really hard. I think there were several things just kind of moved us all at once. We had several pre-conferences, too, at about that time where we met ahead of SCA. Used to be on Thursday, and now it's to Wednesday. We used to meet ahead of time, and two of those books came out of those conferences. So I think, seeing the need and then seeing the need to move, and there clearly was a groundswell behind it. So it moved us back into a place that felt more comfortable for us, I think.
Let me pose a question to the panel. This is, in some things I've been doing, I've made an argument that we should be focused on the study of meetings. And so this is around the language of group. And I'm chair of the group division and very much, affiliate with the study of group communication. But I think that when you start talking about groups, it takes you to a level of abstraction that is inattentive to, is it a water round table? Is it an academic colloquia? Is it, a school board meeting, a court? And that it leads us in different ways from taking seriously whatever is going on in the interaction and how it is shaped by what it is, that it's a group of X or a kind of group. So I just wanted to hear people's responses to that, because I do think that's sort of the starting label, and I want to advocate for opening it up. That somehow, and this is I will trot out a little pet peeve, the label bona fide group really sets me off. And the reason it does is because linguistically, group in the unmarked form is laboratory group, and bona fide is things in the world. So I'm willing to say there's laboratory groups, and then there's whatever you want to call them, functioning or groups in other settings. Yeah. But anyway, reactions.
Well, Joe McGrath could do a good 30 minutes on why he hated the label bona fide group, and I'll spare you that, but I heard it many times. I think this is a space we could reclaim. Mm-hmm. And I just know from in-group, when you say the word group or team to them, it's a very, they've got 30 minutes, problem to solve, your outcomes, And we have a much more flexible view of what a group or a team does and all the things that it does, not what it does, but the multiple things that it does. So while you may complain about how inflexible it is here, you can imagine being there. But I think it's probably a space we need to reclaim. And I can remember reading McGrath's work early on when I was a graduate student, and I think we probably need to revisit that. We're probably the people that can provide more contextual information about groups and teams than about anyone. And without having, I can see the diagram, it's figure 3.2, that's how you know you're a nerd. But he has laid out all the different types of groups that there are and how they're similar and how they're different. And that's probably something that as communication scholars we should reclaim, and we should try to readdress those dimensions. Stevenson Beck and I have been at work for a long time on a manuscript about context and the dimensions of context, and trying to organize them in some fashion that would make analyses perhaps more meaningful to get to the very point that you're talking about. And I think we just have to do it rather than to rely, because everyone relies on the McGrath typology of tasks and the McGrath typology of groups. And that's kind of the standard across all the different disciplines, and we are going to have to challenge that. And that actually can make a really great panel, is to take two sessions and do one on the typology of tasks and one on the typology of groups. Because when I look at those two figures, I don't necessarily find the groups I study, some of which are in meetings, some of which are not. So I think we are more flexible than many of the other disciplines, but it's something that we probably have the best position to challenge.
Yeah, Sandra.
I have a very long history with groups, although I sort of came to it accidentally. I have to make a reference to my history with Dennis, which is that as he was beginning his work in academia, he had to remind me, actually some years ago, that when I was an undergraduate, I took a group, it was a group discussion course with 1969. So he had to remind me of that some years ago. I was a little embarrassed about that. But he introduced me a long time ago to that notion of the content analysis and the utterance. I'm a little disturbed about a number of number of points that have been raised, one of which is what I think of as the McDonaldization of whatever it is that we're doing. Let's get things faster and faster and faster, and that's part of the push of technology. And a lack of patience with, I mean, for example, Twitter. Maybe we should Twitterize your communication. 120 characters or less in a tweet. That might be the way to do it, so that we can get at the content. I don't know. But I think that the other thing, just to kind of go to this piece of what constitutes a group. Lisa, you really did try to get us to some terms of that. But I've started to work on an edge that Tom Soka 10 years ago in the Handbook of Group Communication Theory Research put out a chapter about let's bring together our so-called first group, family. And I just went to the 5-year out family program, and it was intriguing to me that they were working on their identity as distinguishing themselves from interpersonal communication, and that we've done the same thing, but we haven't talked about families, and family and group might be the same thing. Well, a same kind of context, not that they're the same thing per se. But our focus has typically been, I think, in this division. I'd say, and again, I'm not in a perspective of being an editor or having been an editor of journals and communication press, but I would bet that probably at least 90% of the work that we produce out of our scholars is probably directed toward task groups and the processing of how do we become more productive member community. How do we become more community members in organizations? How do we do that better? How do we do that work faster? It's not to say that that's unimportant, because certainly there are huge consequences in terms of kind of an overview of society. Is it you're making a decision? If a group of presidential advisors is making making a decision about whether to invade Cuba or not, then maybe reference to Watergate for those who are a lot younger than I am. Not Watergate, I mean
Bay of Pigs.
Yeah. But I think that several of us have started to look at some points of intersection that might be informative and useful. I think something I heard in the family session struck me, that how do we talk about having our work be useful, as if there's a utility to it coming out. That doesn't mean that we don't do basic research or basic theories, but rather that there's a utility to it. And I think that was something I was hearing in the family communication that they were calling for, how do we make this useful? I'm thinking, well, groups in general, but most of the time people want to look at research or findings because they've got some problem they need to have resolved in some way. The area that I've started to take a closer look at is end of life decision making with families having to make most of those decisions, and that's just a very focused context, to use that word, contextual. I think that if we can find some ways to connect to a larger community, so communities, we're talking about connecting outside. We need to find some ways to connect to folks who are not necessarily college students or academics or people teaching, but beyond that, start to get to the average person, somebody who has to make a decision about pulling the plug on a family member, or we need to put our child. We need to disrupt this adoption, or whatever it might be. And I of course focus on families at this point, but I think that there's a lot in terms of the forgive me, Karen, the bona fide work, the groups and contexts and so forth that we should probably be doing a bit more of. I don't know how we resolve this problem though, the push for somebody taking over. I really, it worries me to think about human factors people, because I also think about the folks in Second Life, and the virtual, that virtual meeting and virtual group stuff is we're moving away from looking at individual, unique utterances, I think, to what are standardized kinds of plans. And that's a place that group decision-making support software has taken us to.
Reactions?
I took my sabbatical many years ago to study groups in lots of different places where we hadn't studied them. And I particularly wanted to study families. I couldn't find enough families to study. And that's because very few families, at least, and this was about 10 years ago, few families ever come together as a group. They are kind of this revolving set of morphing dyads and triads. And so I couldn't find enough to study to make what I thought was a decent enough comparison.
And yet they have a social level that is
correct.
Family. And I agree with you. And I think that some of the problem of studying families grows out of access issues. How do we get at it, and sort of how do we find out who's in that? But families you'll see that, for example, again with these what we're calling consequential or crisis decisions, regardless of the circumstances, that there is some family unit that's identifiable.
Sure. I mean, it's a really good question. But on the other hand, just let me say that few groups operate like academic groups operate. That kind of morphing of who's in the team and who's out of the team happens in the organizational level all the time. And access to families was really difficult. I'm not suggesting that we stop it, but you're right. In the group division, we don't tend to do very much of that. We don't even do much of it in small group research. I get more counseling groups and social support group submissions than I would ever get family groups. So access is one, but just my own personal reflection was I tried. And literally I would have had to live with a family to get what I was after, because they come and go, and that's part of being in a group and being in that kind of group context. But it was just very frustrating as a way to try to study and collect data. It was also a huge IRB problem, and that IRB problem has gotten worse. It has become more stringent.
It has, particularly if you, for example, have a child or someone under 18.
Right.
And I think that adding in families as a type of it exacerbates the problem of the slow-moving data production analysis problem.
And it's kind of a catch-22, because you're more likely to get access to families and other unique group context through grant funds.
Exactly.
But you can't get the grant funds unless you've already studied them. And so there's I think, a unique catch-22 we've got to kind of figure out.
That's why coming in, I think, via an issue like end-of-life organ donation, whatever that might be.
Right. And those would be perhaps good portals to come into it through.
Well, this is not directly responsive to your question, but I think that when you look at efforts in the development of taxonomic structures, whether within the discipline or outside, what we've produced is pretty primitive. I believe that we might follow the lead of biologists who seem to know how to do this, and I think a lot of our decisions are based on criteria that are rather arbitrary. I wouldn't see myself in this role, but I think that's a challenge for people working in this area who are concerned about whether or not we have appropriate classifications of different kinds of collectivities that enable us to understand what is unique about those collectivities and how they differ from one another in the same ways that you can have the discovery of a new species by a structure that moves from the animal and plant kingdoms down to species. And we have nothing that approximates that in our discipline or sociology or social psychology that would rival what biologists are doing. That might be something that people could work on to get at these more profound levels of understanding and more refined appreciations for what is going on in any particular kind of group.
That's Lisa's job.
Yes.
Well, I just wrote a note to myself. I think that's what I'll have my group communication grad seminar do this spring, is take those two typologies and see if we can untangle them.
Well, along that line, there's the family folks have some family typologies, right? I've been looking at some research that's been produced by medical people, palliative care, critical care, emergency medicine, and so forth. So they're looking at families involved in decisions, and I ran across one recently that was family management styles, and what they referred to were the ways, the styles that families as a group have in terms of managing a medical crisis like end of life or some kind of treatment option. So yeah, I think we have there are typologies in various places, but we don't seem to have that in this division, I think, from what I can see.
But Dennis's point is a good one. It has to be on real dimensions, not artificial ones.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe that'll be my NCA paper for next year.
When your seminar does that, be careful about their grasp of what activity offers in the way of meaningful classifications. I use this example in my classes probably far too often, but my mother was part of a bridge club, which would on the surface seem to be a meaningful classification, but over the 50 years that group functioned together, I don't recall that they ever played bridge once. It morphed early on in the life of the group into a social, well, it wouldn't be a social support group, but, well, at different stages could be, because they were all going through motherhood at the same time and had the same kinds of problems, and used the occasion of the bridge club to address larger and common concerns that they had. So that when you use task and activity as defining characteristics of groups, it can be quite misleading.
Right. Just because they call themselves a decision-making group doesn't mean they make decisions. So it has to be the fundamental communicative process that we're looking at, not what they call themselves or what somebody on the outside might call themselves.
We are at the end of our time, so let's thank you, panel. This has been, and audience, for your comments and discussion.